So this really short set of slides is designed to introduce you to the first bit of critical theory that we're going to look at on the course. And this is going to happen in our seminar in week 3 when we read a section, an excerpt from Foucault's Discipline and Punish. So I'm going to give a bit of background to who Foucault was, his kind of contributions, not just to philosophy, but also to kind of Western knowledge as a whole. And then I'm going to talk about how specifically we're going to try and use some of his method and some of his philosophy for thinking about borders throughout the rest of the course. So just a bit of background for those of you who don't know, and I don't expect you to know all of this, but Michel Foucault was a French historian and philosopher. He was born in 1926, so he is one of the kind of central figures of 20th century French post-structuralism. He was born to a middle-class family, so his family were professionals. His grandfather was a physician, and he was a really smart dude. He started university in 1946. If you think about what's going on in 1946 in world history, gives you some kind of idea of what might have been interesting to him. His first degrees were in the fields of psychology and philosophy, and this is really important. He, like me, stayed in the academy. He eventually defended his doctoral thesis in 1961, and he then published this work as his first book, and that is a book called Madness and Civilization, A History of Insanity in the Age of Reason. And then he very quickly publishes his next book, The Order of Things, and then the Archaeology of Knowledge follows soon after. We talk a little bit about the archaeology of knowledge in archives. So if you're in archives, you already are familiar with some of the concepts that we're talking about today. By 1970, again, think about what's happening in the world in 1970, he's installed at the Collège de France in Paris, where he spends the rest of his life. And the Collège it's a really weird place. It doesn't grant degrees the way that the University of Edinburgh does. It purely supports research. But then it requires its researchers to report to the public in a series of lectures once a year. And it's in these lectures that Foucault begins to lay out the evidence for the arguments that form the basis of all of his later and most famous works. So those are Discipline and Punish, History of Sexuality, as well as quite a few influential essays, one of which I have posted to learn. He dies relatively young in 1984 in the midst of a new phase of work. And a lot of the kind of commentary from scholars is that this is really important and significant, that he was about to embark on a kind of next stage in his philosophy. And because we don't have that work, we can only sort of guess at what his nascent and new ideas might have developed into. He's extremely well cited. He's used across disciplines, across the world, to the point where, to be perfectly honest, the majority of the work that uses him probably doesn't need to, and often I think does so incorrectly. So be sure to be careful when you use his arguments in your essays. I'm absolutely, encouraging you to do so, but you also don't need to cite him all the time. He's really influential and important, but I don't think we need to overstate his contribution. You can be specific and careful about how you might use him. So for example, we talk a lot about the panopticon in some of the later lectures. You may have heard that term. I think I possibly discussed it in some detail in Nature of Geographical Knowledge, possibly. So you may know what the panopticon means. It refers to an 18th century style of prison. We've talked about prisons a little bit when we talked about cells in the previous set of slides. And the panopticon was developed by a guy named Jeremy Bentham, who was a Victorian social reformer and philosopher. And he devised the panopticon as a new type of prison in order to create a specific relationship between the prison guard and prisoners themselves. And Foucault writes a lot about the panopticon, and he does so especially in Discipline and Punish. He's really interested in this concept of the panopticon and its role in the historical moment in which it appears in the 18th century. Foucault's work on the panopticon is so famous and so well cited that often he is mistakenly said to be the inventor of the idea of the panopticon. He isn't. It's just that he wrote some really influential and important philosophy about it. So Foucault uses Bentham as an example to illustrate his points about surveillance, for example, about prison life, about the conduct of the self, all of these kinds of concepts that we're going to talk about further. So it's really easy. You know, a lot of people will say, oh, the panopticon, that was Foucault. It wasn't Foucault, it was Jeremy Bentham. So just to kind of give you an example of how Foucault has become embedded in intellectual life over the last few decades. So one of the things that I want to make clear is the way that we're going to use Foucault is really specific. So when you read the chapter or more of the book, as much of the book as you can, you'll notice a lot of content because he's writing about a particular moment in history. He's writing about a bit of the past using the archive. And there's lots of stuff in there. There's lots of content in there. But what we're really going to be using is actually his method for doing research, his methodology for approaching the archive, the way that he uses his sources, and the way that he constructs a history of this concept of discipline. And we're going to do a similar thing when we talk about doing a history of the border. And the terminology here that Foucault uses to describe his methodology is archaeology and genealogy. And these are the two terms that he uses to describe the way that he works in the archive. So archaeology is exactly like archaeology in practice. It's about going into the archive and uncovering, digging through, pulling out bits and pieces of the archive that were hidden or buried or believed to be lost or missing, and then reconstructing a story of the past using that archaeology. And then a genealogy is the next step. So a genealogy is taking a concept or an idea or a phenomenon in the present contemporary moment, for example, the border, or for example, madness, and then thinking about the ways in which that concept has been created over time, right? No concept is without a history. Nothing exists a priori or before us, right? We have to create the things that we know, right? Think back to nature of geographical knowledge. A genealogy is the process of going back in time and thinking about how a concept comes to be known as truth today. So Foucault uses the concept of madness and mental health in the 18th and 19th centuries, which were understood in terms of insanity and madness. And he thinks about how the concept actually develops over time. So first, we're going to define the term discourse, and we're going to be a bit more specific about it. Discourse appears in your geography degree program from the start. I think in fundamental methods, you do a reading on what's called discourse analysis. Spoiler alert, I don't love that term, and I don't love that term for what I hope becomes a really clear reason after I've talked through what discourse is according to Foucault and how people like Robert Young, cited here, think about Foucault's conception of discourse. So this is where things get a little bit tricky. Bear with me. I'm going to do my best, all right? So Foucault constructs quite a complex definition of the term discourse over the period in which he's working. And to give some structure to this, because I think it's really important, I'm going to kind of outline as much of it as I can, but just know that we're not going into nearly as much detail as this deserves. So first and foremost, discourse doesn't just mean language. It's really about the construction and maintenance of rules about what can and cannot be said. Foucault uses this phrase, what can and cannot be said, the exclusion of certain speech acts. So he uses examples of sex, and sex and politics are the obvious ones, right? We're really, really careful and specific about how we discuss and use language around sex, for example, and Foucault talks a lot about that. It's also about the exclusion of certain kinds of people whose speech is discounted. So Foucault uses the example historically of the quote-unquote madman, whose speech acts are deemed to be meaningless and who is as a result cut off from society. So if you're deemed to be um, um, you know, unreliable or incompetent or insane, right, historically, then you are removed from society because your voice doesn't count and the speech acts that you say have no meaning or bearing on reality. So from this binary between reason and mad, but this binary between reason and madness is quite arbitrary. So if you think about historically, right, we talked in Nature of Geographical Knowledge about how women and people who didn't own land and people who weren't titled couldn't participate in scientific practice because they weren't considered intelligent enough or capable enough or able to um, um, think rationally or reason through the problems of science adequately, right? That's what we're talking about here. But this binary between reason and madness is really quite arbitrary. And it's dependent very much on the discourse coming from either side. So the rules from all angles determine what counts as reason and what counts as madness. So if you think about Donald Trump, and how a lot of media outlets have really struggled to deal with Trump's version of the world. They will kind of use various explanations to say, oh, he's ideological, or oh, he's a fascist, or he's a white supremacist, or oh, he's an idiot, or oh, he has early onset dementia, or he's a psychopath or a sociopath, or he's mentally ill, or so there's all these kinds of explanations for dealing with the way that Donald Trump engages discourse. The Enlightenment sees the rise of an ideal for true knowledge, right? We talked about this in Nature of Geographical Knowledge. And if you haven't yet finished that course, you will definitely get there. So the Enlightenment period sees the rise of an ideal for true knowledge that can be verified, quantified, modified, and codified, right? So we're talking about the sites in which this quantification, verification, modification happen. Schools, labs, hospitals, field sites. They all become places where true knowledge gets sorted out from false knowledge, and the truth gets elevated to a position of power. This is key. Foucault calls this insistence on the truth being elevated to a position of power the will to truth, which is the desire for both true knowledge and the power that can be wielded with true knowledge. And really, we're very interested in this question of the power that can be wielded with true knowledge. So all disciplines, institutions, cultural and social systems operate based on internal rules of discourse, which determines the boundaries and limits of knowledge available within them. So we're not just talking about language, we're talking about the internal rules of discourse, which are articulated through the language that we speak. And in order to study and understand how a discourse works, we need to move to the side of it and examine it as if we were examining pieces of a puzzle. So this is the first step in doing Foucault's methods: archaeologies and genealogies of knowledge and thought. So rather than take a border as given, we move to the side and think, well, what constitutes a border? How did this border get made? What's going on here actually? What is underlying our assumptions about what might be true? And how might they not actually be telling us the full story? So discourse works like a hidden or deeper layer of meaning and communication, one that very often isn't explicit. It doesn't just pop out and show us itself. Discourse doesn't like us to see its internal rules. It wants us to think that it is the full story, that it is the complete truth, that it is a picture of reality in all of its nuance and complexity, but it's not. In order to get at discourse, we look at our assumptions. We look at our shared values. We look at ideas that we all consider to be the baseline for knowledge, the things that we hold to be true. And discourse is the word for the underlying rules and regulations that govern the possibilities and the limits of our thoughts. And so Foucault's ultimate goal intellectually was to change or alter thought. He didn't believe that the future of politics or society could be changed unless the very building blocks of our thoughts are changed. And we can't alter thought unless we know how thought is structured or made. And this requires a historical approach, looking at the origins of the things that we take to be truth, i.e., thought has a history. right? We introduced this to you in Nature of Geographical Knowledge, or you will be introduced to this in Nature of Geographical Knowledge. But we're going to go far deeper into this way of thinking and this way of examining the world. And in order to trace and delineate discourses, Foucault combs through historical archives and conducts a really close examination of the fine details of a text. He is looking for often barely perceptible linguistic and thematic patterns that tell us about the underlying assumptions of the authors of the time. He wants to uncover the building blocks of their shared knowledge. And this was profoundly radical for a historian in the 1960s and 1970s. I cannot stress to you enough that this was not how history was done. And still, there are lots of historians who do not believe that this is how history should be done. Foucault was both critiqued and criticized for his method by many influential historians at the time. And scholars don't agree on the minute differences between archaeologies and genealogies, but we can roughly think of them like this. And this comes from a 2010 book by a scholar of education named Lynn Fendler. And she says, Foucault's use of the term archaeology helps to distinguish his historical work from mainstream history. In brief, mainstream history is longitudinal. It studies the development of something over a period of time. In contrast, archaeology is cross-sectional. It studies many different things that occurred at the same time. So archaeologists study artifacts of a single time. They study the pottery, the building materials, the books, the instruments, the artwork of a particular stratum or period of time. And archaeologists try to make sense of how all of those various artifacts fit together. And Foucault's archaeological approach to history is similar. He examined several things that occurred at the same time. So, for example, he studied artifacts of 18th century European linguistics, economics, and science. And then he tried to figure out how those artifacts made sense together. And archaeologists tried to explain what was going on in one selected historical time. When he conducted archaeological studies, Foucault was particularly interested in the archaeology of knowledge, the title of his third book. And genealogies do roughly the same thing, but they also add in the question of how people thought of themselves, how they defined or understood their sense of self in relation to the artifacts he collected. So he'd do his archaeology and then he would ask, what kind of people would live in such a way? Given those artifacts and ways of knowing, how did people think of themselves in the world? So, why have I told you all of this? Because you may have thought that our reading seminar is about studying what Foucault writes in Discipline and Punish. But in fact, our reading seminar is about studying how Foucault writes Discipline and Punish. So I don't really care what you think of his ideas. I don't have any desire really to hear about whether you like it, agree with it, disagree with it, hate it, find it boring, find it challenging, whatever. All of those feelings are there, they're present, they're valid. Leave them to one side. This is really about learning how to read critically by studying the method that Foucault uses when he reads critically. So I have a couple of examples to show you. In the lecture folder, you'll find a link to, and this is quite shameless self-promotion, but you'll find a link to a podcast that I host with my good friend and colleague in India, Ray Chowdhury, and he has been using this episode for many years on his literary theory course. So he uses it to teach his students about Foucault. So I'm going to also use it to teach you, my students, about Foucault. And we talk about Mindhunter. If you haven't seen Mindhunter, it's a really interesting show. It came out a number of years ago on Netflix, quite a few years ago now. So you may have been a little bit young to watch it. It definitely has adult themes. But Mindhunter is about the development of the idea of the concept of the psychopath. And it's a really perfect exploration of how a particular concept goes from being not a thing to a reality, a scientific fact. And it follows the story of the actual man who is a FBI agent who developed the concept of the psychopath as a pathology. And he did it through research. He did it through oral history interviews, essentially, with convicted serial killers who he believed had shared a particular pathology. And in this episode, we talk about how Foucault's concept of discourse is at play in this very real example that's dramatized in Mindhunter. And a different kind of example, which is different, we're not applying Foucault specifically here, but Ear Hustle is a really, really good podcast. It's one of my favorites. It's excellent. It's been on for many years, and it's based out of San Quentin State Prison, which is where California's death row is located. And it's run by an inmate named Antoine Williams, who I believe has been released, and a local artist named Nigel Poor. And they created a podcast where they go around and they interview inmates and they interview staff at the prison, and they talk about what it's like to live in a prison. And many of the themes and discussions and debates that they have tie directly into a lot of the concepts that we talk about when we talk about discipline and punish. This isn't abstract, and what I really want you to take away from this is that what Foucault's writing about isn't abstract. It doesn't just exist in the realm of theory. The state's practices of discipline, its practices of punishment, the way that it creates subjectivities, the way that it creates identities, and the way that it forces people to behave in certain ways are real. And they're every day, and they affect not just us, but everyone around us. And it's really clear, and it's very much on display in the conversations and anecdotes that Ear Hustle draws out and illuminates. This has a bearing on many people's lives and deaths. So we're not just talking about abstract concepts and Foucault's use of jargon. This stuff is lived reality for a lot of people. So that's it for these slides on Foucault. It's about 20 minutes long. I hope some of it started to make sense. I hope you enjoy some of the Foucault reading. I really love reading Foucault. He opened my eyes to the world. My first Foucault was The History of Sexuality, Volume 1. I think everyone really appreciates their first Foucault. And it really opened my eyes to my own lived experience. It helped me to explain a lot of things about what it meant to be a white, straight woman living in North America, for example. So I hope that you find something that you can cling to and grasp in Discipline and Punish. If it's difficult, be patient. It is supposed to be hard. It wouldn't be an honors course if it wasn't difficult. All right, I'll talk to you when I see you on Tuesday. If you have any questions, feel free to just send me an email.